Apologies in advance if I sound weird, I just got over bronchitis. I need to stop making videos on people whose names I have trouble saying. During the German occupation of Poland starting in 1939, the German territories enforced a ban on education, with the exception of some trade schools, punishable by death. There was a bizarre racial theory component behind it, as to be expected with the Nazis, but still, people risked death to pursue education. There were underground courses and schooling being given in secret, and degrees were even being awarded. One of these students, who would have been around 12 by the time of the German invasion, was Leszek Kolakowski. Born in Rodan in 1927, Kolakowski got through his schooling system and emerged a card-carrying communist. He was a proud member of the Polish United Workers' Party, which ruled as a single party from 1948 to 1989, and he was such a big intellectual Marxist that he was able to visit Moscow in 1950, at that time under the control of Stalin. He got there all bright-eyed and ready to see his theories in action, and shit, this kinda fucking sucks. This first-hand experience started an intellectual domino effect in Kolakowski. At first he was just critical of Stalinism, this particular brand of Marxism in mind. In 1953, he got his doctorate in philosophy from Warsaw University. But in 1956, he published this short critique of Stalinism specifically, and it got banned in Poland. But this ban seemed to only make him more outspoken against Stalinism. And eventually, what started with just a critique of Stalinism moved into a critique of Marxism in general, and its more essential elements such as historical determinism. He eventually got kicked out of the party, lost his job, and was banned from teaching. Now, one of the themes in Kolakowski's life that I notice is that the more he was barred from critique and questioning, the stronger he got in those critiques, and the farther away he went from Marxism. One has to wonder if he wasn't banned and censored, but rather engaged with, if he would have remained a Marxist, and wouldn't have done what he's about to do next. Kolakowski left Poland and became a visiting professor in Canada, the United States, and England. While away from Poland, he published his famous 3-volume analysis and critique of Marxist philosophy, known as the Main Currents of Marxism. It made a big splash in the world of academia in the West. But meanwhile in Poland, his work, although banned, was heavily influential in the formation of groups opposed to the Polish United Workers' Party. One of these groups was called Solidarity, an anti-authoritarian trade union group, who grew so big that they negotiated for elections to finally be held, and their leader won the presidency, making a big change away from the authoritarian Poland of 1948 to 1989. Kolakowski, in the end, seemed to have the last laugh. He passed away at the age of 81 in 2009 in Oxford, but he cemented himself as an important historical figure for Poland and for anti-communism in general. Now, in choosing a way to get a glimpse of Kolakowski's philosophy, I have a couple of options. I definitely wanted to include his essay, Is God Happy?, which the title alone is very interesting. But the essay itself is a bit too short to make up a whole video, so I've also decided to discuss his letter, My Correct Views on Everything. Because I mean, come on, the title is probably in jest, but it does seem to give some general ideas about his philosophical outlook. So we'll do both. We'll start with My Correct Views on Everything, and we'll end with Is God Happy? Disclaimer though, the first essay is heavily political, and I'm not very politically educated, hence why I don't cover political philosophy on the channel. I feel like making an exception here makes sense though. Just forgive me and correct me if I make any mistakes. So this letter is in response to this democratic socialist historian, Edward Thompson, who apparently wrote out a 100-page open letter to Kolakowski criticizing him. And honestly, some of the critiques are a bit petty. Like, Thompson gets mad that he's not invited to a conference, that sort of petty. And then Thompson's like, I wouldn't even have gone anyways because there's a member of the British diplomatic service there. Kolakowski's like, dude, we were both supporters of Stalin. We have no moral high ground to stand on. But okay, personal grudges aside, there are pretty big political philosophy points that are covered in this letter, and Kolakowski is able to break it down pretty well. Thompson at one point has this barrage of 3 defenses for Soviet communism. 1, part of the responsibility for Stalinism lies with the Western powers. 2, to a historian, 50 years is too short a time in which to judge a new social system. And 3, communism has shown a most human face between 1917 and the early 1920s, and again from the Battle of Stalingrad to 1946. So Kolakowski responds to these one by one. For the first point, we obviously live in a world where countries affect other countries. But just because of this relationship Should we take away all the blame? You will certainly not deny that a part of the responsibility for German Nazism lay upon the Soviet Union. I wonder how this affects your judgment on German Nazism. As to the second point about 50 years being too little to judge, Kolakowski retells some of the horror stories suffered by people within the Soviet Union. People getting ripped to shreds by police dogs, people getting stabbed to death, people getting thrown into labor camps. There are thousands of these stories, and those 50 years are not nothing to them. Kolakowski also flips the script and asks, how many years are needed to judge the merits of the capitalist military regime in Chile? This letter was written in 1974, a year after the 1973 Chilean coup. Surely if 50 years is not enough to judge the Soviet regime, we shouldn't make any judgments about the regime in Chile, since it just started. And finally, as for the more human face of communism comment, Kolakowski's obviously like, hey, what does that even mean? He then proceeds to list example after example of horrendous things done under the Soviet Union. And yeah, it doesn't really look very human. Next, Kolakowski wants to bring awareness to this double standard game going on that he's noticed not only with Thompson, but other communist apologists. I mean the use, alternately, of political or moral standards to similar situations. This I find unjustifiable. We must not be fervent moralists in some cases, and real politikers or philosophers of world history in others, depending on political circumstances. To illustrate this point, Kolakowski recalls a talk he had with a Latin American revolutionary. Kolakowski asked, what is wrong with torture? Do you think it is a morally inadmissible monstrosity? The revolutionary said, of course. And so Kolakowski asks, and so is torture in Cuba? Well, this is another thing. Cuba is a small country under constant threat of American imperialists. They have to use all means of self-defense, however regrettable. Kolakowski responds, now you cannot have it both ways. If you believe, as I do, that torture is abominable and inadmissible on moral grounds, it is such, by definition, in all circumstances. If, however, there are circumstances where it can be tolerated, you can condemn no regime for applying torture, since you assume that there's nothing essentially wrong with torture itself. Kolakowski here seems to be operating under a deontological philosophy for torture, meaning the act is right or wrong regardless of the context or the results of that action. That's the moral side of it. But the political side is that he notices that many communists will rightly condemn injustices in the US, and Kolakowski agrees that they should be called out. But when it comes to communist regimes, suddenly we leave the realm of morality and talk in the realm of politics and history. I guess this is less of a philosophical critique, but more of a cultural critique, the culture of Marxist academics and apologists. Now Kolakowski's like, alright Thompson, you might respond by saying that you're a democratic socialist and therefore all of what I've said is irrelevant. Like obviously, I'm not in favor of any secret police, so these critiques you have of the Soviet Union mean nothing to me. But still, Kolakowski thinks his critiques are relevant even for a democratic socialist like Thompson for a couple reasons. One of the big ones is that Thompson seems to give a kinda personal, poetic, but not very specific definition for what he means by democratic socialism. He quotes Thompson's definition directly. My own utopia would be a world where the money values give way before the life values, or corporeal will give way to mental war. It goes on a lot more, but Kolakowski has a pretty funny initial reaction to all this. This is a very good sample of socialist writing. It amounts to saying that the world should be good and not bad. Now, despite that, Kolakowski actually agrees that it is bad that people are so obsessed with money and value that over other aspects of life. The difference, though, is that your superiority consists in that you know exactly how to get rid of all this and I do not. Kolakowski's like, look, the reason these socialist examples are relevant to new socialist ideologies is that this universal solution, the state ownership over the means of production, has been shown to not only be compatible with these capitalist disasters such as, quote, exploitation, imperialism, pollution, misery, economic waste, national hatred, and national oppression, but adds to them a series of disasters of its own, end quote. Kolakowski seems to be criticizing the facade of simplicity that socialist ideologies offer. Everything is the fault of capitalism, and once the revolution happens, the problems will fully go away. State ownership of the means of production will solve everything from war to traffic jams. In the letter, we then pivot to something very different, but perhaps this is just to follow the flow of Thompson's initial letter. The issue of using language, not as an explanatory method, but as a method of silencing or demonizing. This is actually an issue that's still pretty relevant today. See if you could find the similarities. We have, in addition, a number of negative words to provoke horror. For instance, anti-communism or liberal. You use these words as well, Edward, without explanation. Aware though you must be, their purpose is to mingle many different things and to produce vague vague negative associations. If anti-communism means that there is no issue in the Western world except for communism, then Kolakowski says he's not an anti-communist in that sense. However, if you don't believe the Soviet system is the most perfect society in the world, then you will be called an anti-communist. It's convenient in the sense that this word can be used for everything and its meaning is never explained. Kolakowski also tackles the word fascist and goes through different examples that he's seen labeled as fascist. 1. People should wash themselves. 2. Freedom of the press is preferable to ownership of the whole press by one party. 3. People should not be jailed for their opinions. 4. Racial criteria are inadvisable in admissions to university. And 5. Torture is condemnable, no matter who applies it. I think he got these examples from his time as a professor in America, witnessing students there. Kinda ironic because Kolakowski was the one who actually had to live under real fascism, but he recounts his overall impression of American university students and their obsession with hyperbolic language here. Needless to say, you could hear that there is no difference at all, between life on a California campus and a Nazi concentration camp. The use of language as a political punishment tool is obvious today, regardless of what side it comes from. You got all the ist and phobe terms, you got the term woke, heck, even the term liberal, which Kolakowski mentions here, seems to be just as vague then as it is today. But after that discussion on language, there's some petty shit, honestly. You said this, but I didn't say that, but I meant this, but you didn't mean that. It's a lot of that stuff. But near the end, I think we get some quotes that kinda sum up Kolakowski's position. Essentially, Kolakowski isn't critiquing Marxism on the basis of pro-capitalism or something, but rather on the basis of skepticism, or maybe even pessimism. He would love a utopia where everyone is happy and all the needs are met. He would. But the world is complex, and socialist ideology to Kolakowski seems too simplistic to fully capture it all. And these failed experiments of these socialist states pretty much confirms that with Kolakowski, even if the apologists won't own up to it. This does not mean that socialism is a dead option. I do not think it is. But I do think that this option was destroyed not only by the experience of socialist states, but because of the self-confidence of its adherents, by their inability to face both the limits of our efforts to change society and the incompatibility of the demands and values which made up their creed. In short, that the meaning of this option has to be revised entirely, from the very roots. Nothing in the world is easier than writing utopias. So that's Kolakowski's letter, My Correct Views on Everything. Again, I'm not a political philosophy guy, so I'm mainly relying on Kolakowski's own definitions and whatnot here. But considering his credentials, I think it's safe to do so. But that stuff doesn't interest me as much. What does interest me is the philosophy of religion, and we could get into that with his essay, Is God Happy? Now obviously, we can't really understand the divine, especially his mind, and Kolakowski admits this, but this essay is still a fun little thought experiment nonetheless. Although the essay is centered around a Judeo-Christian god, Kolakowski actually starts by borrowing a story from Buddhism. Prince Siddhartha was born and lived in royalty, having whatever earthly delights he wanted. But once he left the palace after growing up, he saw the true horrors of the world, and was unable to shake them from his mind, even when he returned to the palace. He was ignorantly happy before leaving the palace, but after witnessing the suffering of the world, he could no longer be happy. And what of the people in Christian heaven? If they live in total isolation from our world, perhaps they could be happy, ignorant of what's going on down here. However, if they have a window into our world, how can they be happy seeing all the suffering going on down here? But that's humanity. What about God? Can God even be subject to emotions? Our conventional view of happiness is an emotional state of mind. But is God subject to emotion? Certainly. We are told that God loves his creatures, and love, at least in the human world, is an emotion. So God is subject to emotions. In the human sense, Kolakowski already established that knowledge of human suffering prevents us from total happiness. Because God witnesses our suffering, Kolakowski deduces that God is probably not happy as a result. He must live in a constant state of sorrow when he witnesses human suffering. He did not cause it or want it, but he is helpless in the face of all the misery, the horrors and atrocities that nature brings down on people, or people inflict on each other. But Kolakowski doesn't seem to be talking about moments of happiness here and there. You know, you could be sad, but maybe a really nice meal temporarily lifts up your spirits a bit. What Kolakowski seems to be talking about here is an uninterrupted state of happiness. And unfortunately, no one can reach this state because of the existence of human suffering on this world. Our knowledge of it prevents us and God from attaining this infinite happiness. There's this other quote near the end of the essay that really explains what happiness is for Kolakowski, and I think it's a more interesting point of the essay rather than asking whether or not God is happy. Happiness is something we can imagine but not experience. If we imagine that hell and purgatory are no longer in operation, and that all human beings, every single one of them without exception, have been saved by God and are now enjoying celestial bliss, lacking nothing, perfectly satisfied, without pain or death, then we can imagine that their happiness is real, and that the sorrows and suffering of the past have been forgotten. Such a condition can be imagined, but it has never been seen. It has never been seen. He wrote this essay back in 2006, and unfortunately he passed away in 2009, being buried in Warsaw. And that is Leszek Kolakowski. For further reading, pick up this book that I got here. It includes the 2 essays we read today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. And with that, I wish you all a beautiful rest of your day.